Thank you, and welcome to Welsh Housing Quarterly's 100th edition anniversary lecture, which of course also marks our 25 years of publication. I'm Antonia Forte, and I chair the advisory board of Welsh Housing Quarterly. I'm delighted to see so many of you here to hear Peter Williams speak on taking the long view, especially as the weather is pretty dire out there, isn't it? So I think it's very good of you to have turned out such a horrible evening. Before Peter starts, there are a few things I have to mention, so please bear with me. I'll try not to be quite as long as you're going to be. First of all, the housekeeping. You need to switch your mobiles to silent, please. This is being filmed, I understand, for posterity, and if the phones go off, it'll obviously disrupt everything, so please make sure that they're on silent. And if you haven't found them already, the toilets are just outside the committee rooms on the way back to the main entrance. Finally, we're not expecting a fire alarm check. I hope there won't be one with this weather, but in the event that the fire alarm does sound, you should leave the building through the main entrance and gather on the pavement in front of the building. It says here, I suspect we'll be sheltering somewhere. Okay, a few words then about Welsh Housing Quarterly. Sponsoring lectures such as this is an entirely appropriate way to celebrate our anniversary. The stimulating debate has been at the core of Welsh Housing Quarterly since its beginnings. Debate in housing and regeneration, and more latterly across many other areas of public service policy in Wales, as the evolution has provided us with greater opportunities to think and plan in a joined-up way. Over the past 25 years, Welsh Housing Quarterly has provided a platform for housing and regeneration to demonstrate that they are key to the success of policy in areas such as employment and training, planning and economic activity, transport and connectivity, and of course health and social care. And the publication is now used as a key communication tool for the work of Welsh Government's Effective Services Board, the work of which is essential in delivering better and more targeted public and public sector services across Wales. To mark our double anniversary, and with additional funding we've received this year from Welsh Government, we have been able to substantially revamp our website. Not only does it look great, but the website will enable readers to continue debate on policy and to share good practice between each edition of Welsh Housing Quarterly. The publication, its website and e-newsletters are crucial reading for anybody interested in what is happening in Wales, not just in public services, but across our country in general. If you aren't already a subscriber, I do urge you to join up. It really is worth it. We've got a number of copies of this edition available next door, and you can also find information about how to subscribe. Welsh Housing Quarterly is dependent on its subscribers and its sponsors, and it's entirely fitting that tonight's event has been sponsored by the Principality Building Society, which hopefully you will have already seen from here. Founded in 1860 in Cardiff by William Sanders, it is the largest building society in Wales and the 6th largest in the UK. The Principality is mutual, which means it belongs to its members rather than to shareholders. It is a long-standing supporter of the housing industry in Wales across both its retail and commercial divisions. In addition to being a significant provider of residential mortgages, the Principality also supports both private developers and the social housing sector. Apparently its commitment in this area is around £200 million. It is involved in a number of key initiatives such as the Welsh Housing Partnership and the Ely Bridge project, working closely with Welsh Government and other stakeholders in developing housing funding initiatives in Wales. On the 8th of September this year, the Principality announced that it had purchased the naming rights to the Millennium Stadium in a 10-year sponsorship deal. Just a month later, the Principality announced it was to sponsor this WHQ anniversary lecture, equally as prestigious, and I can tell you just as gratefully received. Right, and now to our speaker and the main event. Dr. Peter Williams has a long and distinguished career in housing, both in academia and in the broader housing policy industry. He was Professor of Housing Management here in Cardiff University between 1988 and 1993, having previously been Deputy Director at the then Institute of Housing. Whilst here, Peter was a board member of Tai Cymru, Housing for Wales, Chair of Welsh Office's Housing Management Advisory Panel, and in 1990 he was a leading light behind the creation of Welsh Housing Quarterly, so obviously it makes a very suitable guest to be with us this evening to help us celebrate. Since leaving Cardiff, he has been the Deputy Director General of the Council of Mortgage Lenders, Chairman of the National Housing and Planning Advice Unit, and a board member of the Housing Corporation. Peter was also a member of the group which undertook the influential 2008 Ministerial Review of Affordable Housing in Wales, which is usually referred to as the Essex Review. And I'm very pleased that Sue Essex, who chaired that review group, is with us this evening. It's lovely to see you, thanks, Sue. Between 2011 and 2013, Peter was Director of the Cambridge Centre for Housing and Planning Research, and he is currently a Research Fellow at the Department of Land Economy at Cambridge University, researching and writing on housing policy, housing finance, the operation of housing markets, and housing history. He is on the board of the National Housing Federation and is also chair of something called URL, which is a planned for-profit housing association. It'd be interesting if you've got anything to say about that. And during all of this time, which all sounds terribly exhausting to me, he has continued to engage with housing policy and practice in Wales. Peter, I'm so glad that you have been able to be with us this evening, and I now invite you to give the Welsh Housing Quarterly 100th edition anniversary lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. It's an appropriately gloomy night to talk about housing policy, I think. So I've set a stupidly and overly ambitious title here. I mean, the lecture is far longer than the title, but the title's already too long. So you're in for a sustained presentation, followed, I hope, by some discussion. So this is what it's about, and what I want to do is obviously start by just saying what a great celebration for WHQ. I was delighted to play a part in it, setting it up, and I'm delighted to play a part in being here for the 100th anniversary. And I chose the topic, in a sense, reflecting that span of years, the 25 years that it's been in existence. And although, obviously, Wales is central to what I'm thinking about, tonight I want to try and A, not get bogged down in the detail of policy or practice, and B, not only focus on Wales, but try and think across the UK as a whole. And I suppose somewhere in what I'm trying to say is trying to think about the balance between the state and the market and how that's changing over time. And it is fundamentally changing. If you like to characterize it, the state was far more important in 1990 than it is in 2015, and that process is rolling is rolling on. And of course, Wales isn't insulated from what happens in the UK. Housing policy may be devolved, but everything else isn't, and not least welfare, and not least taxation. And those are the central props of the functioning of the housing system in a way that you cannot escape it, even though you might wish to. So what I want to do, it's a very selective one. It may be extensive, and it may be too long, and you may all get very bored, but I've tried to cut down what I talk about. So I will say something about home ownership. I want to say something about private renting. That's one of the great notable changes that's taken place over time. I have to say something about housing associations, given some of the people that are here tonight, and then say things about housing supply and housing need, structural change, and so on and so forth. There are lots of topics I'm not covering, and I can only apologise for that, but that's the way. Can I just add to what Tony said about WHQ, and again, we're delighted Jeff Childs is here in the audience. Jeff was one of the Welsh Office civil servants who was instrumental in engaging with Bob Smith and I to think around what else could we usefully do to support housing in Wales. And the creation of Welsh Housing Quarterly was very much of that in discussion between ourselves. And Welsh Housing Quarterly has only had 3 editors in 25 years. Tamsin, of course, who is here somewhere, was the main editor for a very, very long time, but Angela Evans before and Jules Birch now. A huge achievement. 3 editors in 25 years is itself something quite notable. And the journal itself has been the envy of all the other countries. But certainly in Scotland and in England, the view that, well, Wales has got one of these, why don't we have one? And it's always been a source of some irritation. And I think the way WHQ has evolved has very much matched the shared spirit of Welsh housing. The way processes here are more about partnership, more about engagement, more about integration, a much stronger process than happens elsewhere, certainly in England. Our first cover, which hardly is uplifting, but I'll show you in a sense, is the Penrhys estate from the Rhondda Valley, and it looks appropriately bleak, I suppose, and it wasn't a very exciting cover, was it? But you notice, even on the topics then, putting a figure on housing need, and indeed specialist housing needs as well, and demand for housing in rural areas. They were all efforts to try and reach out to what we saw as key issues at the time. So let's go to 1990, which, I mean, for some of you is beyond comprehension probably. For others of us, this is really a sort of dementia group who've come together this evening to try and remember the past. The big challenge for us will be to think about the future, but the big challenge for some of the younger people in the audience is exactly to think about the future and where it's going, because those next 25 years will go remarkably quickly, and you will be in that future before you know, and you need to participate in that process. And of course, 1990, we're at the bottom of a deep recession. There were really serious problems with the UK housing market, 75,000 homes in possession, major collapse in the house building industry, house prices plummeting, a spiral of decline that was taking place as all of those things drove down the system as a whole. So it's a really big issue with the government coming in with a series of housing market packages aimed to re-stimulate the market, save people from losing their homes, to get social housing to take on some of the burdens, to buy out, for example, homes from developers, and to generally reinvigorate the market, and not unlike what we saw, of course, in 2007, 2008. And then we had the long march, if you like, post 1990 through really to the global financial crisis in 2007 of a fairly sustained period of growth and change. And in that, obviously, we had devolution, we had 6 UK elections, we had 4 Welsh elections. We've had numerous, innumerable, exhausting numbers of A, housing ministers, and B, housing policies. And I just want to ask, this is the quiz. You knew it was a quiz tonight. It's not really a lecture, it's a quiz. So how many housing ministers have there been in England? And I've even pushed the date back here to 1945 to really stretch beyond when Gareth Hughes first started getting involved in housing. So I thought you know, many people, I guess, how many, would you all guess 70? 50? 50? Am I but any more? 50. It's actually 35. Far fewer than you would think, actually. It's not at all how we perceive. And in Wales, and it's a bit of a problem because there's always this problem about how you classify a housing minister. I mean, there may be a problem about whether they actually do anything as a housing minister, but it's also the issue whether they've called the housing minister. I think there's been 14 since 1990. There have been 18 in England over that period. There's a gentleman next to you already asleep. It's shocking. And the typical term is 1 to 2 years. And that, you know, gives you some sense of, it's a very complex subject. If you don't get to grips with it very quickly, the chances are you moved on. The reality is, housing is not a portfolio where anybody thinks they can land any big wins. They're just sticking plasters to sticking plasters and moving on. The big issue that everybody has to grip is the fact that housing is a long-term issue and can only be solved in the long term, and that's beyond the tenure of any housing minister, and that's a huge, great weakness. So yes, so that's just a picture which I took out of the famous and esteemed publication, of course, essential to everybody, UK Housing Review, which tried to list since 45 who all these ministers were. What's striking, if you like, is the tenure gets shorter and shorter as we get closer and closer to today. And actually, of course, nothing much else changes. Okay, so going on. 1990 and all that. Housing was a problem then. It's a problem now. That constant change of ministers and policies, it does create an unstable operating framework. It creates an unstable policy framework. If you like, if one of the problems of the UK housing system is volatility, constant surge and then decline, constant surge and then decline, it inhibits investment by the parties in that, not least house builders, who are confronted with buying land, building homes, and never knowing whether to invest because the next cycle of decline is about to kick in. And that cyclical event actually adds to the instability and the volatility of the UK housing market and the failure of the UK housing market to deliver. So instability of the policy framework is part of the process that feeds instability more widely. And of course, we also find that we don't have any clear cross-party consensus on issues. We have actually, so that when you have a change of government or even a change of minister, you have a change of policy. So this tidal sweep of moving in and moving out and taking people out, taking policies in and out of the agenda adds to, particularly in the private market, just adds to the uncertainty about how that process can actually be managed and delivered over a long period of time because you can expect policy change. And right now, of course, 2015, we are in a horrendous maelstrom of policy change emanating from the UK government, bringing up fundamental questions. The key issue about this government is it probably has a mandate for 10 years. It can now confront issues much more radically than a typical five-year government. It can look ahead over time and take that view, and it clearly is taking that view, thus the much more radical approach to welfare reform, to housing associations, to rents, and a lot else to come, I suspect. Wait till you get the Comprehensive Spending Review announcements next week. So I think we have this problem that it's a very difficult issue anyway, but it's added to by these things. And not least, of course, that housing is very much linked to people's aspirations. It's hugely interlinked now into politics. It's a big political issue, bigger right now than it's been for a very long time. And of course, much understudied and much under-researched is its link to the economy. If you have an underperforming housing market, you actually add to the problems of a performing economy. This is one of Britain's great economic weaknesses in terms of competitiveness. It has a housing system that does not deliver for the economy, and it will inhibit the economy's success and achievements going forward. So there's a really serious issue here that if you constrain labour mobility, if you have high house prices, you force up, you've put wage pressures on, you have labour that can't move, you have an economy that's not responding appropriately to a changing global set of circumstances. And housing is absolutely central to that. Now, Gareth, in an article in WHQ, Gareth Hughes, sitting down the far end there, the father of Welsh housing, and that gives you some sense of how old he is, makes the point in here in trying to take a forward view. There are 2 or 3 really good articles in here about the future, but he takes the view, well, in one sense, everything's changed, and in some senses, nothing's changed. We're still in a mess, but actually in other ways, Wales has devolved. There are issues around Welsh control and going a different way that gives you some hope and some strength. But it's, you know, as I said earlier, these are no means entirely, I think, Gareth, you would agree that that's sort of a conclusion that you reach, but you recognise all the dangers associated with that. And what change we have had, not least the fall and rise of the private rented sector, the rise and fall of home ownership, the rise and fall of council housing, and indeed possibly and of housing associations. Some fundamental changes to work their way through. I just want to pick on some of those. Tenure in Wales, the rise and fall of home ownership. Home ownership's been falling since 2007. We've seen the rise of private renting and of housing association homes since 1999, and we've seen a dramatic fall in council housing since 1979. In Wales, in 1990, 71% of homes were in home ownership. It's now down at 70%, a small reduction. The change in England is much more dramatic. The private rented sector has almost doubled. Housing associations have become more significant, and a huge decline in the role of local authorities as providers of homes. It's worth reminding us, I think, that home ownership across the UK was something like 53%, and private renting was 29% in the 1960s. We only started counting housing tenure in the 1960s. It's a remarkably recent thing that we actually became interested in that. Before then, we were interested in the quality and conditions that people lived in. It wasn't about where you lived and how you lived it, who owned it. It was simply about what the conditions were, whether it had an indoor lavatory, whether it had running water, whether it had light, whether it was ventilated, etc. So in 1960, about a third of the population was living in private rented homes. Don't forget, in 1900, 90% of people were living in private rented homes. And what's striking about that figure is those that don't think anything can change is, of course, 1900, 90%, let's say, lived in private rented housing. By 1990, you're down at about 8% living in private renting. So over 90 years, that sector almost collapsed completely. And the idea, therefore, within a generation, you can have remarkable change, I think, is empirically shown. And of course now, Wales has been more stable in all of this, but we've still seen the surge in the private rented sector here as we have elsewhere. And I'm just really making the point that we've had significant change over the, oops, that's better, press the wrong button. Okay, let's talk about home ownership. What's striking about home ownership is it looks the same on the outside, but it's actually changing remarkably on the inside. We've had the rise, there are now more people who own their homes without a mortgage than have a mortgage, because basically the flow of mortgaged home ownership is falling. And so more and more people are reaching the stage where they've paid off their mortgage and they now own their homes outright. And what we've seen in this process, because of the contraction of mortgages and because of the weaknesses of people being able to get into the housing market, we've seen a rise in the use of cash. Something like a third of housing transactions are now undertaken by cash. That's a big increase from where we've been in the past, and it reflects the fact that mortgages are, in a sense, controlled, or the flow of funds is, to some extent, controlled through the Bank of England. Because that's been contracting, and because that's been tightening, cash, and also because of people's affordability constraints, people haven't been able to raise large mortgages, people have been forced to rely on more and more cash, more and more, a bigger deposit, and in some cases for older buyers, it's easier to raise cash and use cash rather than it is to get a mortgage. So cash has become a really key component of the home ownership market in a way that it wasn't previously. And the cohort rates of home ownership are changing dramatically. And I'll illustrate some of these in a few moments with more slides. But so in other words, each generational group, those that were born in 1990 compared to those born in 1980, for sake of argument, that the rates of home ownership experienced by the people in those cohort years is actually going down. And the question is, will it ever recover? And that's one of the key questions. If it doesn't recover, what are the consequences of that? These are issues that we have to confront and think about, and the evidence is very strong to show that it's looking very, very difficult to actually see that recovered. And we've got affordability. There are clearly real affordability tensions in the UK housing system. Clearly, people are finding that the ratio of income to the property prices that's now crept up from 5, 6. In London, it's now something like 14. And of course, although it's all been cushioned by the fact that we have very low interest rates. So on some measures, mortgage cost to income measures, it all looks very positive. But of course, that all relies on some things. A, those low interest rates continuing. B, relatively steady inflation which erodes the value of the borrowing you've undertaken. C, some sort of increase in wages which will again give you more buying capacity, more mortgaging capacity over time. But let's imagine that we have the possibility. We now have deflation, we have sustained low interests, we possibly go into a period where wage increases are up from where they were but remain remarkably low, and we might get strong interest rate increases. Actually, affordability levels will worsen quite sharply in a way that if we think they're bad now, they could get a lot worse in the future. So I think we have to caution with where we are. And of course, all of this is subject to these measures, which again, many people, I mean, Peter and Gary know it as lenders, but over the last 5 years, what we now have is the Bank of England, post the global financial crisis, much more closely involved with the UK mortgage market. And through the Financial Conduct Authority, there is now a much tighter system of regulation of mortgages. So, for example, lenders have to undertake a full affordability test, a much more stringent affordability test on people's capacity to support a mortgage. And they have to test whether that person could still afford the mortgage after 5 years with the addition of an extra 3% stress test on that mortgage application. So that's a big test. And then the Financial Policy Committee, part of the bank, has put in place a loan-to-income ratio control and a loan-to-value ratio control, which actually limits the amount of the book, of individual lenders' books, they can advance on those products. If you put those together, what it actually means is, if you thought 207 was profligate mortgage lending, 215 is much more tightly controlled mortgage lending, and if you like, if you trim the edges, then there are people that were getting into home ownership when it was expansive who can no longer get into home ownership in a new, more tightly regulated mortgage market. So not only do you have the affordability tensions, but you also have, if you like, the regulatory tensions which are squeezing down who can become a homeowner or not. And we can see this is expressed when we look at things like transactions, house sales. The number of house sales historically was about, UK-wide, was about 1.8 to 2 million a year. It's been down at 1.2, it's slowly creeping to 1.3, it's probably never going to get much above 1.4. So we're moving into a much more lower liquidity market. So that means houses turn over much less frequently, and it means that there are fewer chains. We already see now more and more people are coming to the market. They're not in housing chain. For the older people in the room, housing chains were a reality of life. Increasingly, for those privileged buyers that can enter the market now, there are fewer chains and in some senses less choice of property because the properties aren't turning over as frequently. And certainly if you look at the more prestigious areas, obviously an affordability constraint, but people are simply not moving on from those properties. They're staying where they were. And indeed, of course, with stamp duty change and everything else, it pays them to stay, to make improvements to the house they're in rather than moving. So we are in a world where transactions are declining really quite sharply, has implications for estate agency businesses, has implications for moving businesses, has implications for white goods businesses, and many other things. These things aren't abstract concepts. They are actually part of an operating economy and how it's drilling down. So what I'm trying to say is here's the housing market operating, this is how it's operating, and those are the impacts it starts to reach out to the wider economy as a whole. Very important. And so what you now find, of course, with that stamp duty pressuring down and more people in certainly the most affluent markets doing what is called let to buy, in other words, let out your existing property, in other words, retain it and raise a mortgage on it and buy another home. Let to buy is meaning that in many London postcodes, for example, there are very, very few properties ever come onto the market any longer. It's simply shriveling away because now people in that neighbourhood own 2 properties. And so it's becoming tighter and tighter and tighter. And of course, that all relates to this issue about assets and investment, about housing is not being held for use, it's being held as an investment good. And that's one of the dramatic changes really over that long period, and certainly the post-war period, is the way housing has moved away from something you needed and wanted as a place to live, as now it's been part of your investment portfolio if you're lucky to have one. And the scale of interventions are getting bigger and greater as an attempt to try and prop that up. So Help to Buy 1 is the government's equity loan scheme repeated in Wales, and Help to Buy is the UK-wide mortgage guarantee scheme, both very significant, both pumping in significant support on a demand side to first-time buyers and others. We've got the Starter Home Initiative in England with the promise of 1 million homes, and also yet to be announced, but Starter Home Plus, which is actually linking starter homes with Help to Buy equity loans. So there will be people who are able to get 40% off their mortgage costs through that. And no doubt next week we shall see more, because basically the government is determined to turn back some of what it sees as the denial of aspiration of young people particularly not able to enter the housing market, and the government recognising the political risk of that. This is just a few illustrations really. There's my point. The top one is prices as a ratio to earnings. Wales is below England, but basically that's gone up sharply. But mortgage costs, because of reflecting low interest rate, have been remarkably steady. Okay, the two have diverged and will continue to diverge. This is the cohort effect, and this is really quite important. So the privileged, those born in 1960, and there are some in the room probably born in 1960, they moved to this point here, something like, what do we got? We've got, about 20, at the age of 25, something like 30% were home ownership. This group, born in 1990, 10% are in home ownership. And the question is, what will that trajectory be for that group born in 1990? And the reality has to be that the chances are that it will be a much diminished access to home ownership, with the consequences we have to think about. We don't know. We don't know. If we have a dramatically improved economy and lots of things happen, that may improve their prospects considerably. We may dramatically revolutionise the mortgage market, for example. We may have more government initiatives on first-time buyers. The fact is, these generations have done well out of it with ownership levels of 80%. The chances are this generation, this 1990 generation, obviously you can do this year by year, is that it'll flatten out much more at a much lower level. And I think that remains a source of concern. Of course, the upshot of that is, of course, the number of adult children living at home with their parents. A great joy to those that are parents, but a great source of frustration, no doubt, to those that are forced to live with their parents. And that number has gone up dramatically, 2.2 million to 3.3 million, and will continue to rise. I just thought I'd pause here just because when everybody talks about home ownership, as they do quite a lot, look at the endless property programs on television and God knows where else, you get slightly sick of it. There's often this argument that the UK is odd, and Wales not least is odd, in having high levels of home ownership. What you will see here actually is in the European League, if you like, of home ownership, the UK, and now it's lower than that, 69.9, it's now somewhere down here, was never in the top league of home ownership. It's always been lower down. It's never been up where Romania is at 96.5%. And Mrs. Thatcher used to get very upset about these figures because all these buggers were communists. and capitalism was over here. And so there was something fundamental. Of course, what it actually meant in reality is of course, the high levels. You have to think about this. It's home ownership in a different form. Much of this is about agricultural small holdings. It's not home ownership in the way you might conceive of it in a terraced house in Penarth or wherever. But simple crude comparisons. UK has never been that high. There was an ambition in Wales once, if you remember, the housing minister announced that Wales would have 80% home ownership. And indeed, Gordon Brown, and it's interesting how quickly it was expunged from the record. Gordon Brown set out an aspiration to have home ownership in England, in the UK, at 80%. And it lasted on the web for about 3 or 4 days before it was kind of removed. And it's like all these things now, it's quite hard to pin down what's actually happening. Right, I'm moving on. So home ownership has changed dramatically. Let's look at another one that's changed dramatically over this period. I was part of the generation that actually thought private renting would disappear. Once it got down to 8 and it was continuing to decline, I personally thought it was just going to go. And now it's our fastest growing tenure. So it just shows that, you're very much bound by the period you're in. You think it's going to go this way, and then suddenly something else happens. And of course, the interesting thing there is how much it was driven by the mortgage lending industry and the estate agency industry dreaming up buy-to-let. It wasn't a government scheme of sponsorship and recovery. This was the market taking it back, saying there was a need for this, there was a case for it, and taking it forward. Now, government, of course, has seen this as a free ride. For some years now, government has seen the expansion of the private rented sector as an enormously good thing because they weren't having to pay for it like they pay for social housing. Yes, they were paying the housing benefit costs, but they weren't providing for the cost of provision. Most private renting is not new build. Most of it's buying existing property. So there are some underlying problems with it there. But they saw it as a no-cost expansion of choice. And only recently have they realized that actually there are real issues about families in short-term tenancies and about people in retirement on low incomes being permanent benefit dependency in private renting, which in home ownership they may actually have low housing costs and be able to support themselves without recourse to the state. A big issue in this current era. And government obviously then realised there were huge consequences about the politics around aspiration. And in England, they'd set their face against regulating the private rented sector, categorically dismissing a review of regulation and the outcome from that, to actually decide that they weren't going to do any more, even though they're retreating now, whereas Wales and Scotland have actually moved ahead. In England and elsewhere now, the starting to turn the wheel, I think, on the private rented sector, being significant tax changes, initially focused on non-DOMs, people non-resident in the UK, and then most recently in the summer budget, the tax changes around wear and tear allowances, on the tax relief granted to landlords as part of their business, and indeed crucially, and much missed by most people, is the change in the way the tax liability is calculated from net to gross. And that will have a big impact of moving a large number of basic rate landlord taxpayers into a higher income tax bracket, which will then, and I know there's clearly shock here because there are landlords in the room, and indeed we know that 25% of Conservative MPs are landlords, that will have some impact. So whether that works through into practice, we'll see, but it certainly is very significant. And then, of course, the Financial Policy Committee keeps flagging up buy-to-let and indeed the private rented market as a risk to stability and about landlords offloading property if the housing market starts to decline quite sharply. Now, it is worth just reminding us that buy-to-let only funds about a third of the expanded private rented sector. 2/3 of it are funded by commercial mortgages and cash. So whether you can actually regulate buy-to-let and stop those risks of stability or not is a moot point, I think. But it's certainly what's striking, I think, now is the mood music around the private rented sector has changed remarkably over the last 2 years, and the potential is for tighter regulation in there. And I think it's both a problem and a solution. It's a real dilemma, I think, for governments. And then housing associations. You'll be pleased now I'm sort of coming to the end of those bits soon, and I'll be able to move on to the last sort of concluding comments. But housing associations. Clearly, private, often charitable associations, organisations backed by government in terms of grant, housing benefit, regulation, privileged status in many ways. We've seen over the long period of time a march from being funded 100% grant down to effectively no grant in some areas, with the view that housing benefit would take the strain. There have been, if you like, unstable grant regimes. And now the question is, of course, the rent regimes which underpin the move to private finance are themselves becoming vulnerable, despite, in a sense, the social contract between the sector and governments. And I think the migration from social to affordable rent in England, and then housing benefit curbs, and then rent curbs in England, really do expose the sector to quite considerable risks. And those risks are not of default and collapse, but simply about the way it will change its mission and role. and what we're seeing in England, and I think to some extent in Wales, we will begin to see consequences of that, and I'll come back to those in a sec. Is there a plan? I should say Wales, I think, is on a better course there. It's a more stable framework and a better position altogether. But as I said to Stuart earlier, what happens in England is that the policy window of possibilities starts to widen. And even though Wales is in a different set of policies, the impact of people reaching across the border to say, oh, but they're doing that, starts to widen and change the debate in Wales in a way that actually starts to infect how people discuss and think about policy issues in other countries. So there is no island, it seems to me. Is there a plan? I had the discussions with a group of Conservative MPs a few months ago. One of them referred to housing associations as warehouses for welfare dependency. It certainly gave me the feeling that there were strongly held views about the role of housing associations and their role in society. And I think, there may not be a plan. It may be a series of events and thoughts. But the latest one, of course, is the whole issue about selling grant, about whether they could sell grant to investors. It doesn't actually pay any interest, but sell grant to investors who government would then see as a way of raising money itself. Whether that can happen, I think that was a flying the kite one, but who knows? And then there's this issue of declassification, reclassification. I know this is utterly boring to many people, so I'll move on from it quickly. But basically, housing associations were in the private sector. About 3 weeks ago, they found themselves in the public sector. And the consequences of that that's only really for technical accounting purposes, but actually underneath that, if you look at the experience of organisations that have moved from one to the other, they then find there are regulatory consequences that flow from that in terms of the way they have to report and present their accounts, the scale of intervention potentially inside government and so on and so forth. And also, because government is planning to deregulate, to get it back out again, there is the possibility that the whole regulatory framework is thrown up in the air and rather chaotically dismembered. And again, we may regret what we might get. So I think, suddenly it moved the number of non-public financial organisations, 334 to 2,100. That was all the associations going in. And it just raises the question, and Gareth rightly asked, are we in a world of collaboration or competition? I mean, I think this is increasingly taking us to one of competition, and we'll see where we go. But it's a really tricky time, I think, for housing associations. And some work we did at Cambridge on looking at housing associations' business plans and poverty pointed up absolutely clearly the way housing associations' mission statements and underlying business plans were changing. That they were moving from a strong focus on social tenants and renting to a mixed mode of joint ventures, private development, a whole load of things, private rented subsidiaries, a whole load of ways to try and balance the books, which were inevitably then making people ask, well, where are we going to put the force of our effort? Should we continue to house the spectrum of people that we house now? Should we widen the spectrum of people that we house now? And that clear mission creep, I think, is emerging quite strongly across English housing associations, if not in Wales. Just a few slides again, just making the point how Wales Wales is the green line, I think. Yes, English housing expenditure collapsed post the GFC. Wales had been low and not particularly spending a lot on housing, and it's got lower since. So it's not been a particularly attractive picture in terms of investment in housing. And in terms of people thinking about their commercial options, it's based on a very small sample of associations, but I think you can see there how different associations have quickly moved to start thinking about doing other things, whether it be build to rent, outright sale, market rent, intermediate housing, key worker, student accommodation. Very few really are saying no to private market activity. And that's quite a significant shift. Strikingly, many of them are trying to do it on their own. I mean, if you're taking on more risk, one of the solutions in life is to do it in a joint venture with others. What's striking about that slide is actually many of them don't have separate governance. Certainly many of them don't have ring-fenced subsidiaries. And many of them, in a sense, are exposing their core business, their social housing business, to the risks associated with that. And I think that's quite a significant issue. And I just want to dwell on that. I mean, I think we shouldn't forget some of the other big issues in the housing association. One of them, I think personally, is efficiency and effectiveness. When I came to Wales, we were involved in a study of housing associations and local authorities to see which was more efficient and what size was more efficient. Inconclusive evidence conclusion. But it's still an agenda that's running very hard about how big is an effect, what's the optimum size for a housing organisation to be efficient and effective. And the HCA did a study of unit costs, and indeed Cardiff, we did a study of classification, both of which were quickly forgotten. And I actually think the sector has had real problems in dealing with the agenda of efficiency and effectiveness, which I think is now going to be imposed upon the sector in a way that they've exposed themselves. I don't think, in that sense, the sector is particularly good at looking in at itself. And I think with mergers in the air, we need to be looking at that much more strongly. I think the housing association sector does run a lot of risks in the way it operates. It has a view of itself that is, by and large, that it's a good thing and people will always want us. Whereas I think in the world that we're moving into, which is much about competition and use of scarce resources, those concepts are being challenged in quite profound ways. And thus, I think the issues about a merger code, much tighter value for money regime, and much more board focus on this. I mean, I'm always struck when I go to the NHF board members conference, the only people who speak to the board members are executives. And you think, hold on, this is a board members conference. Why don't board members talk to board members? And why do they have to be talked down to by chief executives? And there's something still not quite right about the way the housing association sector has thought about governance and the role of the board and the over-dominance of chief executives in a number of occasions. I think that's a great weakness, which isn't universal. There are lots of organizations that do it well, but they don't universally do it well, and I think that's a real problem. The HCA research, which I'll show in a sec, very interesting, looked at efficiency, looked at effectiveness, took out all of these factors, which might explain the difference between housing associations in terms of cost, rural, dispersed, decent homes, deprived, supported, transfers, etc., only explained 50% of the variation in costs. And what you got was a picture like this, where actually, I know it's not an easy thing to see, but when you think the operating cost per thousand start at about 2,500, this is just general needs, so it's not all the other, start at 2,500, and up there are something like 17,500, even amongst the big boys, up here in size, stock of over 30,000, at around, let's say, 3,000, and this one up here at over 5,000. No, 50%, 100% difference in costs. How can that be? How can that be? And I think that kind of thing is red rag to a bull when you've got ministers and officials looking at that kind of data saying, what on earth is this sector doing? So that's enough of my rant about housing associations. It's at least to get a few people upset. Let me go on to supply and then quickly start to conclude. Housing supply is in a mess. It's low and it's rising slowly. House builders have been rebalancing their balance sheets, which is good. But there has been there have been quite a lot of mergers of big house builders, but actually their output on mergers has gone down. So if we've got bigger scale, but actually almost universally they've merged and their output has gone down. And similarly, they've eradicated the small and medium-sized building enterprises that used to provide about a third of house building output. So there's a big problem about the capacity of the speculative house building industry to produce the supply boost that we need to start changing some of the things that I've talked about. Of course, the issue here is that these are private companies who don't own the housing problem. They've got their shareholders to satisfy. I think people have unrealistic expectations about what a speculative house building can deliver, or indeed should deliver, because they've got their own businesses, their own city funding, all the other things that they have to think about when they're performing. And I think, therefore, we have to start thinking about, and they are receiving huge subsidies in excess of 20 billion now. They've done far better than the lenders. There are alternative suppliers, and that has to be thought about. Contracted via housing associations, local authorities, institutions themselves contracting, self-build can do a certain amount, off-site, direct commissioning by government is clearly currently on the agenda. But in the next breath, of course, in terms of supply initiatives, Section 106 has been a major instrument in England and Wales in terms of providing the flow of sites and opportunities to provide affordable housing. That is now going to be cannibalised in England by the Starter Home initiative, which effectively will be done by developers without involving housing associations, and that will be homes, either intermediate ownership homes or indeed affordable rent homes. But certainly it wipes out a major flow of new build housing by housing associations for rent. And some of the other policies that we thought might transform supply, the new homes bonus, community infrastructure levy, have not been transformative. So we tried hard to push up supply, it hasn't happened. And the rash of housing needs, bizarrely, in the last year, we've had housing needs studies done in Wales, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. They all, and I'll show it briefly, but they all highlight the fact that we have a continuing problem, despite the fact we have demographics that are driving the needs anymore and ever higher. And of course, despite the fact that we have an economy that is desperately in need of more capacity in the housing system. And those were the needs studies. I won't dwell on those. So my question then, as I move towards a close, is what are we observing here? Are these cyclical changes so it'll all get right in the end? Or are they fundamental structural changes? I think one of the problems in all trying to absorb any change is the fact that when you're in the middle of it, it's quite hard to see it. You know, whether it's the change in your own body or indeed the housing market as a whole. It's quite hard to, it's only when somebody else says, by God, you look old. You realise how much you've changed and other people, and you hadn't seen it yourself. And so I think the housing market has got the same dilemma, that in a sense it is changing, and I personally think it is changing structurally in quite profound ways. We've still got this hugely cyclical market, which is a real problem. Government in the past has offered counter-cyclical measures, they've invested at times when the market was underperforming. Increasingly, you think that's unlikely. And indeed, they're intervening now in what is called a pro-cyclical way, in a sense they're stimulating demand. They're not stimulating supply, they're stimulating demand. So government is adding to volatility. Government is now taking onto its books house price linked investments, Help to Buy equity loans, sit on the government books as an investment, and there are many more. And I think what we're seeing is a load of structural changes take place. The one I mentioned earlier about transactions, you've got an older population who move less frequently. You've got more renters, landlords trade less frequently, and you've got later entry into home ownership. All of those things mean actually there will be fewer transactions. The market slows down. We have mortgage market rules, big structural change, big affordability tests, stress tests and all the rest, a more tightly constrained mortgage market going forward. We have a bigger private rented sector, almost enshrined now. Hard to see how that gets turned back. We have all those Financial Policy Committee macroprudential regulations and interventions. That's enshrined in policy now. That's part of keeping an eye on the banks process, and I see that as a continuing process. Affordability, we've increasingly seen a housing market relies on two-earner households, single-earner households ever more frozen out. Hard to see how that changes. Roll the clock back 30 years, be lots of single-person households could enter the housing market. Many households now can't enter without parental support, clearly very selective, only some parents can support it. Again, a structural change. House building and lender, or stamp duty, a fundamental change in stamp duty, now slightly more progressive than it's been, and actually bearing down on the housing market in quite a significant way. And I think really interesting in policy which was originally all about mixed tenure, didn't matter whether it was owning or renting. Now the government in England at least saying it's all about ownership, nothing else matters. And then we've got house building and lender consolidation, and we've got a labour market which is moving towards unstable jobs and incomes, which of course sits underneath all of this. So if all these are tightening, this just adds to it because it makes it more difficult anyway. So I think the outcome of all of that is a tighter, narrower market despite the greater diversity of circumstances that people find themselves in. And so then to the issue about the balance between the state and the market. It's clearly ebbed and flowed over time. It's moved from acute state involvement post the war and a retreat in the 70s and 80s, Mrs. Thatcher and so forth, who began the deregulation of banks in the 1980s. And what we've seen is more market mechanisms introduced, whether it be rents and pricing, competition for resources. Yes, the GFC brought in a restatement with more active public engagement, but what we've seen there is a shift back again. And it's striking in England, and indeed I think elsewhere, is the shift from grant to loan to guarantee. The way the state is intervening is changing. It used to be about grant, it's now about loans, and increasingly it's about guarantees. So you simply support the market rather than fund the market. And these are quite profound shifts, quite a serious change. And I think they're partly a product of fiscal tightening, but they're also about people thinking, hold on, did we need to do that grant-based regime that we used to do in the past? And then we've got the increased exposure to the market via all of those funding mechanisms, whether it be equity shares, private finance, etc., and via tenures, because we're running down the scale of the social housing sector, we're increasing the size of the private rented sector, and of course we've got the home ownership sector. And cost rent, which was the original ambition to have a self-funded, self-financed, low-rent regime for social housing, increasingly absolutely unachievable. So I think all of those things expose more households to market pricing and costs. And what we now see is government increasingly reliant on house price inflation, and that's shared by owners as well as providers and government. So I think market dominance is increased, likely to expand further. Wales, I think, is different than that, but actually is still quite exposed to it itself and doesn't escape it. I think basically the new ground rules that are emerging challenge all of our policy presumptions. And housing association surpluses, I think, become a real exposed source of tension for government, and not least with local authorities as well. And then, of course, there's the issue about what we do with grant and investment. Now, Judy, when she, again, in this very excellent issue of Welsh Housing Quarterly, set out two attempts at thinking about the future, which it's remarkably difficult, isn't it, to try and think that far ahead. I mean, I'm kind of clear about 2020. I think I could give a coherent view of 2020. 2025 starts to get quite hazy. 2040, I began to think, God, what might happen? And you only have to think about what happens in a 5-year period, or even a few days period, to realize there's turbulence and uncertainty, and it's quite hard to actually keep up with all this, and that's both global, national, and Wales. I do think, since I've been involved in housing since 1975, I see now a system at complete breaking point. It's far worse now than it was then. It's failing to deliver in a whole series of ways, and we're trapped into a series of short-term initiatives. At the same time, population growth marches on. And of course, one of the issues in all of this is, where do all these people go? We've done nothing to address market volatility. Supply remains remarkably constrained, and there are obviously things, but there's an issue still about land. And house prices simply continue to rise. Indeed, government has gone further than that. It basically underpinned the housing market in 2007 to stop it declining. So in other countries, there was a rebasing of the housing market in line with people's capacities. In the UK, there wasn't a rebasing. It was underpinned to stop it going down for reasons, good reasons, as well as bad. And then there's the agenda about which we dare not speak. And that is, of course, the question of taxation. If you can't solve it through supply, and you can't solve it in other ways, can you then, or should you then, even consider the question of tax? Now, we've seen movements on stamp duty. We've seen movements on tax reliefs. And Wales and Scotland are being more radical about thinking about this. But I think there is the possibility that a properly structured property tax is beginning to come into view. And although many people say it's impossible, it's all about timing and phasing over a long period of time. And if you have a 10-year government, as I believe we have in the UK, that's a good long period to actually start thinking radically about long-term issues, about solving housing problems. So if we settle supply, curb house price inflation, think more clearly about the housing system as a whole rather than the elements in it, it's possible that 2040 might be better than 2015. But, look at the numbers here. 2014, 646, rising to 64.6 million, rising to 74. And in England particularly, 54.3 rising, so up 10 million. Huge pressure. The pressure much, much less, even in proportionate terms, in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. But that's going to happen. That's locked in. That ain't going away. There's nothing government's going to do to stop that. That's what we have to deal with. And that's one of the things we're not dealing with. So prospects for 2040, I mean, there's a few people who have done some thinking about this, but some people argue there will be a big crash in 2025. And you can certainly argue for that. 2020 is probably secure. 2025 becomes more challenging. I think private renting will continue to rise. I can see that being 30 to 40% of total provision. And I can see that partly because I think by then, 2040, it's 2040, Bob, by then housing associations will be firmly in the private rented sector and they will all be merged in. There won't be the distinction between the private sector and the public sector in terms of housing provision. It'd be like other countries where basically government puts money into private organisations to secure particular policy objectives, but they're not distinguished, if you like, by which category they're in. Home ownership will probably bumble along at 60%. Home ownership inheritance may start bubbling through. It's always been one of those great mysteries about why doesn't the big impact of the rise of outright ownership and the rise of all these older people with homes, why doesn't it? Of course, the issue is longevity, health, and people are living much longer, and that's putting more pressure on the housing system. I think employers will come back into housing in a big way. They'll have to do that to remain competitive. And I think likewise, councils will become much more effective, but mainly as part of their economic strategy. The housing association sector, I think, will diverge fully. It won't be described as a movement or a sector. They will be organisations that operate in the private market, won't be identifiable as such. And I think there could be a significant and effective property tax. I could be wrong. Striking thing about this, and it's sad, this was in the, and I know many of you are readers, in the Daily Telegraph, or the Sunday Telegraph supplement, but it's just an article on the impact of the housing system on fertility and on birth. And basically the number of older women in their 30s who can no longer afford to raise a family because they've got nowhere sustainable over the long term to live. And it's striking that there are more mothers now first-time mothers over the age of 35 than under 25. And the average age of motherhood for the first time is over 30. So it's moving up the age spectrum. And this is where you get the real consequences of a constrained housing system that actually it's stopping people doing what they would hope to do in their lives. And that becomes a real issue. So I think it is a crisis, and I know it's an overused word. It's hidden to a large degree. We don't see lots of homeless people on the streets. The impact is on individuals and households, and on society, and employment in the economy. We don't see it because most of us are relatively well housed. But the fact is there are increasing numbers of people who are not well housed, and they're coping by sharing, by living with their parents, doing whatever, but they're not on the streets for the most part. There's an issue about homelessness, and the Welsh Homelessness Monitor will be published in a couple of weeks' time. There are now 3 million commuters now spending more than 2 hours a day travelling to and from work. You look at Cambridge, we do surveys on where the staff now live in relation to university, and they are living ever further away from the university. They're now effectively commuting from all the lower priced housing markets like Luton and Hitchin back into Cambridge for an hour or so every day to get to work in Cambridge. And that will be true. It's not just a London phenomenon. That will be true increasingly in Cardiff and in other cities around the UK. Commuting to work, and that of course puts pressure on infrastructure, roads and everything else. So all of these things multiply and aggregate in quite disastrous ways. Adult children living at home, as I say, sharing, it all impacts on household formation, impacts on overcrowding, impacts on health, educational achievement. These are the real costs of failure of a housing system, and yet we don't enumerate them, which is a great weakness in research terms. Wales has avoided some of this, but I have to say I think it's coming your way. 1990 in retrospect, well, it wasn't a good year, but in one sense it's a lot better than where we are now. 2015, yes, again, we saw the recovery, and again we see Wales, but as I said earlier, it's not an island, and I think some of the things there come towards it. So I think 2040 may well be a remote issue in our minds, and not least for the younger here. But if we don't start now, whether that's thinking about housing as a long-term issue, and politicians and civil servants and organisations need to be brave, because we have 25 years to sort out 2040. And when we have the 50th Welsh Housing Quarterly anniversary lecture, then hopefully somebody can talk more positively about it. Now, I'm going to stop here, but while you're thinking about things you want to say to me like rubbish, I will just go to it. These are some references, those that really want it. Just for fun, we looked at Welsh housing ministers. There's no doubt some of this is wrong, but it's remarkably difficult even to pin down who the ministers were, actually. And we would happily take advice on who they should be, but even there have been quite a few over time. And then this one, there's a wonderful interactive graphic on the ONS site, which I was going to put on and play for you, but I've actually got the starting slide and the finishing slide, which simply starts by plotting properties above 300,000. And then each year it grows. And this is the final year. Now, this is my point about it's coming towards you. You know, try as you might, this is the contagion. See this as a disease reaching out. You can argue where from, but it's actually coming close towards you. And I think we can't ignore that. So on that note, Antonia, I shall stop. And I'll leave that there.